Thank you so much for joining us today for our presentation. We're thrilled to have you here with us. I'm Laura Smith, and I'm going to be giving you an overview of the presentation by talking about some of the broad kinds of conceptual landmarks that we'll be touching on as we talk about the study. And after that, I'm going to introduce the presenters, and they will be kind of drilling down into those areas and also connecting the dots and telling you about the study that we did. In the meantime, we're all a research team coming to you from Teachers College, Columbia University's Department of Counseling and Clinical Psychology in New York City. So here are those central issues that I was mentioning a minute ago. You can see there are 5 of them. And first and foremost, we're asking you to think with us on a meta level today about the continuing resilience of racism in our field, despite decades of sincere public disavowals and countless multicultural and diversity modifications and reforms. In going forward to address the goal of eradicating racism from our field, what can we learn? Can we learn anything from questioning the kinds of questions that we ask about race and the shape of the knowledge that we create as a result? These are, of course, epistemological questions, meaning they're questions about what we know and how we know it. And the answers to questions like these are far-reaching in that they not only shape our work as psychologists, but our work as psychologists helps inform public discourse about important topics like this. Moving to number 2 now, this is one of our intellectual mentors, philosopher Christy Dotson. And this is exactly what she writes about, the epistemological aspects of oppression. And according to Christy Dotson, the kind of meta-level inquiry that we're talking about is exactly what's needed to bring about a kind of social change that goes beyond modifications and reform, what she calls third-order change, a transformative change. The epistemological investigation of race and racism dovetail in our field of psychology with the work of critical psychologists. And in the study you'll be hearing about today, we were especially influenced by critical psychologists, theoretical psychologists, who have critiqued our field's conventional comportment of itself as a discipline of variables in the study of human life. So what does that mean? This is an approach whereby complex human experiences and social phenomena are operationalized, right? They're reduced and represented by variables that are not as complex and that are decontextualized and that lend themselves to measurement and to statistical modeling in concert with other variables. So one of the immediate concerns with an approach like that is the adequacy of a decontextualized variable, right, to represent something that's very complex and far-flung. But that's not the only concern, which brings us to number 4, which is another conceptual brick in our foundation, the theorizing of French sociologist Michel Foucault. So Foucault talked about and wrote about, well, many things, right? But among them is the fact that the representations of knowledge chosen for promulgation by prestigious professionals tends to align with the operations of the powerful social constituencies that are responsible for their status in the first place. So that's another way of saying that the representations of knowledge that we promote as credible and true, the ones we choose, have political and power-related implications. In fact, Foucault believed that the representations of knowledge considered credible and true in any era are inseparable from considerations of power in that area. And Foucault talked about the mutual support that power and knowledge offer each other as a politics of truth, or a truth regime. So the first four areas that we've touched on now, these four cornerstones, inform the question at the heart of our study, which is, how might conventional, quantitative approaches to the study of race and racism actually perpetuate the marginalization of people of color and support the resilience of racism, even in areas of the literature that are associated with the redress of systemic inequalities? We studied this question using critical discourse analysis, CDA. CDA is essentially a qualitative approach, but it's different from many others in that it examines knowledge, it examines language as action, right? Knowledge and language as purposive social action. And in studying our question of interest in this way, we discovered support for number 5 of the central issues in our presentation, which is what philosopher Charles Mills called an epistemology of ignorance about race and racism that are at the heart of whiteness. An ongoing production of ignorance about race and racism that are necessary to the ongoing resilience of racism as a system of discrimination, and that perpetuate a white-identified status quo. Let's take a look at what the agenda has in store for you now. And I'll be introducing your presenters as I introduce the agenda. Naira Madden will be starting us off by talking more about some of these sort of theoretical foundations. She will also tell you a bit about the health disparities literature, which is the literature we interrogated. And she will also mention for you the way that we conceptualize whiteness, how we're using that term. Next, Cindy Asensio will move on with additional theoretical foundations, now coming closer to the ones that underlie our choice of method, the work of Michel Foucault. Cindy will also kind of mention a sidebar consideration, which is the alignment of our work with what's being called movement towards the creation of the psychological humanities. So CDA isn't just one method. Different people use it differently. Marco Trevino will be telling you about the way that we employed CDA in the study that you're going to hear about. Oliver Shue will present highlights from the results. Michael Sheffy will be interpreting the results by juxtaposing them with that conception that we mentioned earlier, Foucault's conception of the truth regime. And then finally, Tyner Gordon will wrap things up for us by talking about suggestions for future research. I can't wait for you to meet this team of amazing researchers and brilliant thinkers. Please help me welcome Naira to start us off.
Thank you, Laura. Hi, everyone. So the field of psychology has a long history of being complicit in maintaining systems of oppression, and specifically racism. And in recent years, psychologists in general, the APA specifically, have implemented policies and procedures so as to contribute to mitigating the influence of systemic racism in our field. And as we all know, in 2021, the APA issued an apology for its complicity in maintaining systemic racism. And as part of this apology, committed itself to implementing a series of resolutions so as to contribute to mitigating the impact of systemic racism. And as well-intentioned as that apology was, the content of it wasn't new. The content of it is something we've seen before. It's been said before in different ways by the APA, by psychologists. And what that tells us is that though members of our field have for many years been explicitly indicating and an interest, a willingness, a commitment to eradicating racism, our field is still entrenched in it. And so using that as a springboard, we designed our study so as to better understand the resilience of racism in our profession. And specifically, we wanted to understand how is it that racism, that whiteness, continues to be perpetuated even within a field of research that is explicitly designed to better understand the impact of race, which is the health disparities research. And so the health disparities literature is essentially, it addresses differences in health status in one population group in comparison to another more advantaged population group. And the research within this framework typically tends to address issues of social justice and equity. It is a post-civil rights era quantitative methodological approach that emerged in the 1990s. And it has always positioned itself and continues to position itself as a pro-equity paradigm. And we have no doubt that health disparities research that is conducted with the most sincere intentions so as to better understand and address the differing rates, the disproportionate rates of distress that we see and that become apparent when we separate individuals into racial categories. However, there are some problems that emerge with the widespread use of health disparities, particularly when we're using it in relation to racial categories. And that's because racial categories are naturally occurring categories. And so when we use the term health disparities, we are unintentionally distorting and obscuring the root cause, which is that the lack of health equity that we see isn't because of the disparities. The driving force behind these disparities, behind this inequity, is racism, which is a socio-cultural system, which is systemic, it is structural, it is intentional discrimination. And it has been considered, or it has been termed in the past as the cause of causes. And our studies' theoretical underpinnings are grounded in critical psychology. Actually, hold on. One additional thought I had about the health disparities research is that when we were reviewing this literature and we were going over the discussions around these health disparities, we found that in these discussions, racism wasn't often included, whether as a talking point or even just, it often wasn't mentioned. And so our study's theoretical underpinnings are grounded in critical psychology, which is a field that addresses social inequalities through a meta-theoretical perspective. And critical psychologists analyze language and power in the context of race and racialization. And what they've observed is that when we use racial categories, when we design our research, when we interpret our results using these racial categories, we are unintentionally recreating the violent history of racism, where people are divided into groups. Some are deemed as inferior and therefore subjugated to a series of atrocities. And then we also drew from the work of the philosopher Charles Mills, and specifically his pioneering work, The Racial Contract, which speaks to the ways that white individuals are able to maintain ignorance around race and racism through a series of cognitive distortions. And that allows them to maintain the power that is so often associated with whiteness. And throughout this study, you're going to hear us talk about whiteness. You're going to hear us refer to whiteness, or throughout this presentation as well as our study. And when we use this phrase, we're referring to these three interrelated dimensions. So whiteness is a phenotype, which is essentially a collection of visible physical traits that lead someone to designate another person as white. Whiteness is a cultural context, so really thinking about the expectations, the customs, the values, the history that is typically associated with the experiences of white people. And this is what is typically considered by society to be the norm or to be synonymous with humanity. And finally, our third dimension, which is, I think, the most critical to our study, which is whiteness as a set of power relations and its association with socio-historical dominance. And now Cindy is going to talk a little bit more about Foucault and how we were inspired by his theory, and then also our use of critical discourse analysis, our methodology.
Thank you, Naira. So as Laura mentioned previously, the work of French sociologist Michel Foucault grounds our theorization of professional discourse. Foucault details a circular, self-perpetuating structure between our systems of knowledge and understanding, known as our episteme, and discourse, which is the language and the logic structures that are available to us to convey the knowledge that comprises these systems of understanding. Both knowledge in both of our episteme and discourse are shaped via their relationship to power. And this power is concentrated in what Foucault calls the society's regime of truth. And this regime decides what discourse is accepted, as well as who can create and sustain the accepted discourse. Thus, dominance is enacted and continuously reproduced through our everyday talk and text that appears to exist naturally. But moving towards a more nuanced discourse, we'll look at the psychological literature. So we conceptualize the psychological literature as a professional discourse. And as a professional discourse, we argue that the psychological literature reflects and perpetuates a particular set of power-related historical assumptions that delimit the possibilities of knowledge creation and expression. So if we look to the psychological literature's response to social phenomena, such as the social constructions of race, then we can see that researchers are given the power to create and constrain social conceptions of race that are then widely held, but go unquestioned due to the high degree of influence that is afforded via their presentation in scientific discourse that we accept as natural and factual. Now, if we look to discourse as an artifact and a perpetuator of power arrangements, then our examination of this discourse can potentially reveal to us politically hidden and unquestioned narratives that thwart our ability to enact social change. And there are many different approaches to the examination of discourse. The one being that we chose, critical discourse analysis, is one that is built upon the Foucauldian conception of discourse as politically meaningful in both its language and action. And our decision to use CDA was based on many different aspects, including our area of inquiry, our belief in the method's potential to reveal to us the relationship between dominance and discourse, our interests in rhetorical structures and strategies such as denial and concealment of the causes of causes that exists within discourse and continue to perpetuate social inequity. And finally, we see and we believe that CDA has tenets that align with what we call the psychological humanities. But what are the psychological humanities, and why is it so important to us? As psychology continues to assert itself as a STEM discipline, we see that the focus has been placed on the how of psychological phenomena and has put aside the psychological humanities that attempt to address critical questions of what, why, and because. Additionally, 3 perspectives have been offered to us about what constitutes the psychological humanities. First being taking a meta view of psychology, so drawing from science studies and philosophy and ethics of science. Second being humanities-based approaches that have actually emerged within our psychological field. And the third being approaches from outside of the psychological field, such as arts, that address core topics within psychology, one of them being subjectivity. And in line with subjectivity, the psychological humanities actually emphasize the first-person meaning that lies within psychological phenomena, and stresses that these first-person meanings are embedded in social, cultural, and historical contexts, and that psychology must draw from disciplines outside of the field in order to accurately and appropriately remember the origins of these contexts. And CDA, as a growing interdisciplinary research movement with an explicit sociopolitical stance, has urged and challenged us to look beyond the world of variables and to look towards methods that connect our work with other disciplines, such as philosophy, history, and cultural studies, to name a few. And now, Marco will detail just how we implemented CDA.
Thank you, Cindy. So as you can see, our team relied upon the work of Mills, Foucault, and the psychological humanities to create a foundation of knowledge that we frequently revisited. These theoretical philosophies guided our study's aim to analyze the discourse relevant to race within the psychological health disparities research, particularly the articles that addressed mental health differentials according to racial, ethnic identity groups. Now, it's important for us to understand that there's no single implementation of critical discourse analysis. Similar to other implementations of CDA, we were interested in finding themes in the discourse. Themes here being used colloquially and not a reference to thematic analysis. Nonetheless, this resulted in a code book of thematic annotations that we'll look at in just a moment. Additionally, we relied on some aspects of consensual qualitative research, or CQR. For example, we used frequency labels to better understand the data that we are gathering. And more importantly, at the heart of our research was team consensus. Now, throughout the process, it was important for us to achieve methodological integrity and trustworthiness. At the onset of our project, we came together as a team to discuss what we expected to encounter when engaging with the literature. Of course, there was a shared expectation that we would learn something new and important with respect to our academic inquiry. Some of us also expected to find an absence of sorts, an absence of community voices, and an absence of historical and cultural framing. Other expectations included encountering ambivalent or racially coded language, such as the word urban. Together, we wondered whether researchers would make note of their identities or biases in the research, and we expected that some researchers would remain discursively detached from their studies' populations. We revisited and discussed these expectations at length to improve the fidelity and perception management of our work. And as I previously said, we incorporated the team consensus process to further support the trustworthiness of our work. Now, when gathering the articles, it was important that we used a recent sample of publications. As you know, the public and professional race-related dialogue continuously evolves, and it was important for us to minimize the confounding effects of history and unfolding events. So we initiated our selection process via an APA PsycNet search of peer-reviewed journal articles using the search terms mental health disparities and race. In accordance with the APA definition of health disparities as mentioned earlier, we excluded the articles whose focus was not empirical group comparison, but was rather theoretical commentary, an analysis of therapist attitudes, or other issues outside our scope of interest. This resulted in 14 qualifying articles, all of which incorporated quantitative methods, and all of which had a post-2020 publication date. After we gathered these articles, we then analyzed it as a team of 9 members. We divided ourselves into 2 sub-teams, each sub-team serving as the primary analysis for 7 articles. This analysis looked like each team member thematically annotated each article individually before then coming together as a sub-team to argue those thematic annotations into consensus. Once consensus was achieved, we then collaboratively wrote a discourse summary in narrative form using the coding as a basis for an integrative overview. Now, here's a brief glimpse into what our codebook looked like. You'll see that our thematic annotations were categorized into linguistic and rhetorical elements, the discursive construction of race and racism, constructions of psychological practice, and the ideological work done by the discourse. It's here that we relied upon the theoretical philosophies, as mentioned earlier, to analyze the author's word choice, their connotations, the tones and styles, and their assumed meanings. We looked for the mentions of race and racism or a proxy word and tried to understand the article's implications of race and racism. We asked questions like, how did the article understand psychopathology? What did the author assume to be curative? Other questions were epistemic in nature, like who or what was going named and unnamed. What systems were being sustained, reproduced, or refuted? And who has access to voice and influence? These thematic annotations gave insight into how researchers were discussing race and racism within the health disparities literature. And so after each article was analyzed by our team, we then came together to discuss the overall findings, which Oliver will now share with you.
Thank you, Marco. The results I will present to you are going to be listed according to those 4 categories that Marco has laid out for us. So we'll just dive in right ahead, but I wanted to mention that our results are not comprehensive, the ones that we're addressing to you now, but the ones that we are highlighting are going to be very crucial to Michael's section, which is coming up after mine, in which she will implicate psychology within the Foucauldian truth regime. So, starting with the first element, which is the first category, the linguistic and rhetorical elements, you may note that the first 2 themes that we identified for you here are purely universal and essential to empirical science literature. The first is the gap in literature and its use as a justification for the work. Now, there's nothing wrong with that by itself. However, given, as Laura has described, that psychology is a discipline of variables, there are an infinite permutation of variables to be studied. That means that there's always going to be a gap in the literature to be filled. That means that psychology by itself will always create more research because there are always going to be another variable, another model to be created. In addition to this, we found that the discourse often uses this gap in literature as what we call a thought-ending cliché. That is, if the study is unable to explain an effect or a result that it finds, it may simply explain that away as another gap in literature to be filled, thereby ending that thought and passing it on. The second thing we identified for you here is the passive voice. And what it does is that it facilitates the ability for institutions and the researchers to avoid having to disclose their own positionalities regarding race and racism. And this contributes to a process we call passivation, wherein the lack of this exact type of knowledge allows the results of these researchers' work to become immutable facts that then basically serve the purposes of those in power. Moving on to the constitution of race and racism, we found that the social construct of race was never contextualized, defined, or explained. And this is in spite of the fact that we were specifically looking at racial health disparities research. Even the term racism was typically not mentioned by name, and if it was ever mentioned, only in passing, typically within the first couple paragraphs of the introduction. Oftentimes, these articles would use proxy terms like discrimination, and it will talk about those who are affected by racism as being at risk or vulnerable, using euphemisms like that. Additionally, there was no mention of social dominance or subordination or any of the status quo power arrangements. There is no mention or description of the systems that benefit white participants while harming BIPOC participants. And this contributes to a process of invisibilization of power and privilege. Moving on, the construction of psychology in these literature. We see that all of the literature solely uses DSM language to describe psychopathology. In addition to this, and in conjunction with the invisibilization of power and privilege that we found, this constitutes, psychopathology is then constituted as an individual phenomenon, something that only a person has and never something that society can cause a person to develop. The discourse of the corpus also reify the status and importance of psychology. Going back to the gap in literature, every single article we looked at calls for more research to be done in the field. That is one of the main concluding points of all of these articles. This endorses the incremental helpfulness of research, potentially to never reaching the end point. And additionally, researchers themselves are constructed as objective arbiters of legitimized knowledge. That is, they are given rule-making power. They have the ability to decide what is data, what is evidence, and the truths regarding the experiences of those they study, specifically BIPOC participants. They also have the ability to decide then what they need. Moving on to our final category of ideological work done by the discourse, we see that the discourse creates an ahistorical, decontextualized, biologistic racial group world. That is to say that the words used by these articles make race into something that lacks or is absent of its social, historical, or cultural significance. That means that it can be then used at that moment as a biological individual level variable, something akin to age or height. In addition to this, we see that the discourse therefore holistically upholds the status quo via an unnaming. As Naira mentioned earlier, the greatest danger to BIPOC participants, the causes of causes, goes unnamed. Researchers and institutions get to avoid implicating themselves in these systems, even though that is where their own power comes from. And we'll end with a thought that the failure of psychological discourse to name and critique status quo power structures is not a politically neutral act, rather that it functions to support status quo power arrangements. And now Michael will synthesize all of these results and more and implicate psychology within a Foucauldian truth regime.
Thank you. Hi. So in context of what Oliver just went through with our results, we thought it was really important to contextualize our results within that truth regime. So Cindy talked about it earlier, but the three main components of this truth regime are first, that we have powerful segments in our society, and they are the ones that are going to delineate conceptualizations of what functions as true. We also know that we as a society are who puts those people in those powerful seats. And from those, we can deduct that what is actually coming out as true is only a portion of the actual truth. And in that, health disparity researchers, which includes us and many of you, get socialized into this regime. And what we establish is that there is a conventional framework that's operating where race is getting decoupled from its relationship to its power dynamic. And in doing so, we end up promoting ignorance about race and racism. Oh, sorry. So just like that logic of a truth regime and a truth configuration, we found that the health disparity discourse follows a recognizable structure where first in the article, if you're lucky and get a really, really good article, there'll be a word or two that indicate to the reader that this article is going to be about pro-equity. But most times what we found was as soon as you flip past that introduction, the article is pretty much focused on statistically categorizing mental health illnesses and how they arbitrate towards BIPOC individuals. There's an especial importance that's also placed on the fact that more research has to be conducted there. So researchers are pushed towards finding nuanced ways of implementing interventions instead of actually finding nuanced ways to implement pro-equity action. So what gets highlighted is the need for BIPOC groups to have more statistical categorizations about how ill they are in comparison to their white counterparts. What gets hidden is how well this engine is actually structured and functioning. In that way, we know that if we can continue to say BIPOC communities are ill, then we are going to, in turn, continue to give us opportunities to write about it. What gets normalized, unfortunately, is that the cycle of rediscovery I just identified actually gets constituted as this pro-equity action. It's really important to emphasize that our results don't just say that we have identified that articles neglect to identify race within its social historical context. What we're saying is, in the way these publications are outlined, race, as we know it in its whole sense, is substituted with a fragment of that sense of racism. And in doing so, what happens is race gets erased from the context of dominance that it was originally begotten in. Race gets contorted into this fragment of an individualized conception rather than the societal function that we know it is. Race then gets erroneously compared and juxtaposed with this incomplete narrative about illness in BIPOC communities that we're just not finding in white communities. And what that's doing is promoting ignorance about race and racism and whiteness and how they are currently focused and functioning in our socio-historical context. So when you get to an end of an article, you kind of want to ask whose interests are really being served here. But when I finished and when my team finished, it became very clear that it can't be the BIPOC communities that are actually benefiting from these publications. This context that a power structure can reproduce and produce in order to maintain its status quo is seen in an ideal called interest convergence, with Derek Bell helped develop, and we know Derek Bell for his work on critical race theory. He constitutes that interest conversion. Historically is the set of pro-equitable actions that are more likely to gain traction in the society. What he said was the ones that gain traction, the ones that stick around for decades, are the ones that don't cause too much discomfort to people occupying those higher powers. So when we look at interest convergence within our framework of the health disparities, we can see it sort of peeking through in the way power, privilege, race, and racism get to go unnoticed and unnamed. We can see it in that cycle of rediscovery where it seems like, I read an article that sounds like this. I read an article that had the same results. And most importantly, what we get is that the pro-equity stance we're afforded only gets afforded if it's socially desirable for everyone, if it benefits everyone. And in that way, we all become participants of this system that furthers our professional advancement and doesn't actually deliver the help we're trying to these BIPOC communities. To zoom out a little bit, I thought we should picture or create a picture of what we think the regime involving health disparity literature actually looks like. So if you come back and you look at it as like an individual occurrence, you see that there is an amplification of ignorance about race and its contextualization. Then you see that what we think is pro-equity work in the field is only called pro-equity work because it's statistically focused on aggregating illnesses to BIPOC communities. And in those understandings, we see that the opportunity to publish, the opportunity to make new discoveries is going to supersede the urgency that we feel as health disparity psychologists to eradicate and name racism. And in that way, race and racism become fragmented ideas in academia, and they don't push boundaries or require us to ask whether or not our work is actually intending to end racism and eradicate it. Collectively, we see baby researchers like me and a lot of us on this stage correctly inferring that there is a cycle that will beget successful publication and successful sciences. The problem with that is we incorrectly interpret that successful science is good science. Zooming out even more, we have psychologists who've been in the field for many years, and unfortunately what happens is their original ideology and hope of wanting to target racism within this framework gets truncated because academic publishing does not allow that amount of expression. And I understand that that snapshot is quite disappointing, but we're not going to end on that note, of course. Tyner is going to come, point us in some really good directions and ways that we can get off this cycle of rediscovery.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, team. So I encourage us to zoom out even more. I know Michael started to ask us to do that. We have taken you on quite a deep dive today, but let's adopt a 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 foot view. As we have talked about what critical discourse is and what our psychological discourse has done in terms of perpetuating the status quo, we know that taking a critical eye to our work is a lifelong endeavor. Therefore, we've got different levels of suggestions for you. But before we give those, we really encourage you to come with us on a journey of genealogy in the spirit of Foucault. Meaning, how did we get here? Asking ourselves that question, looking at our practices, and looking at our use of discourse. How did we get here? In order to do that, we've got immediate and intermediate suggestions, all with an eye to what Christy Dotson calls third-order change, which we heard Laura talk about before. And this is where our 10, 20, 30,000 foot view can really help us recognize, name, and acknowledge structures and systems that are being perpetuated, that are unequal. In terms of immediate change, we can start by looking at the way that we use language. We know that discourse reflects and perpetuates societal thought. And the calculus here is very simple. Words plus constructs plus omissions equals the perpetuation of status quo. Therefore, we want to ask you to think about the active voice. You heard us talk about the passive voice, but now let's talk about the active voice, meaning adding researchers back into race-related research. People conduct research with, on, and for others, and we must recognize that humanity. And since the passive voice is a relatively recent scientific research endeavor, we really want to take this opportunity to have you ask along with us, what's been accomplished by the adoption of the passive voice in our research and in our writing, and what has been lost? Building on that, we are also suggesting that we pay more attention to and are honest about system-centered language. So that means building on the active voice and adding systems into our race-related scholarship and research. This will counteract the omissions that I spoke about before. And what does this look like? Well, as you heard Marco point out, we've got phrases and terms such as urban, or here, as you can see, vulnerable community. We are advocating for the use of simple and accurate statements that speak to the truth, something towards African American community exposed to additional harm as a result of racism. The systems are here and they are alive, and we must speak to them. Another immediate change, building on the other two, is looking at race as a variable. You heard Oliver speak about the way that race is stripped of its context and therefore stripped of the types of harm that it actually perpetuates. So we are advocating for adding the context to the use of race as a variable. Race exists and justifies domination in many different ways. And to not include that in our writing of our research is truly a disservice and can dehumanize. Intermediate changes, well, those will require us, as a psychological community, to collaborate together, to reflect, and to undertake some Foucauldian archaeology. Let's do a deep dive, a dig, and surface our tools, the tools that have kept the status quo in place or even helped to build it. In that way, we ask you to think about the psychopolitical validity of your work, of our work. Who does count as a source of knowledge and who doesn't? What are we doing about the oppression that we are finding, that we are discovering, that we are recognizing that has existed for a long time? And how are we incorporating our strategies? We also ask you to think about interest convergence. Who is benefiting from the status quo, keeping it in place, even within our research or within the writing that we share? And finally, we ask you to think about racial capitalism. Who benefits from racial identity, writing about it in the ways that they are, and leaving out or adding the omissions into their work? In order for you to do that, we came up with some reflection questions that we want to share with you today. I will not read them to you. I know you can read them on your own, but we really do hope that you will take them into account and really think about them. The other hopes that we have for you are that you've heard something of interest today, something that's inspiring to you to go back and think about discourse and the power that it carries in the world and especially within our work as psychologists and psychologists in training. I want to thank our fearless leader, Laura, and I want to thank the team for an amazing time together and amazing work. And thank you for being with us today.
Just add my thanks to Tyner. Recognize for a moment how awesome this team is. Was I right about that? Right? So amazing. We're going to hang around afterwards outside. Thank you for coming on this journey with us, and we'd love to chat with you more, either outside here or feel free to reach out to us at Teachers College. Thanks, everyone.